Sarah, welcome. I was so much looking forward to this conversation. I've read your book, and as you can tell, I absolutely loved it. And as I mentioned earlier, I've read so many books on personal development. Most of them, they're pretty similar. But with your book, it's so full of practical tools and tips, and also a few concepts that I've never heard of, such as existential therapy. I'm like, what is that? But I think it would be great if you could explain to the audience what the existential therapy is and how is it different from other modalities.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. I'm also so glad you liked the book. Um, yeah, existential therapy, I feel like I want more people to know about it. I think it's more popular in Europe than North America, but still, I don't think it gets enough attention. So when I think about therapies in general, every therapy has like a lens through which it understands a problem. So some people will understand a problem through attachment, for example, and some will look at the family system, and some will look at your cognition and your behavior. And so existentialism is just one of those lenses. And what it looks for is unifying human experiences that most humans have and most questions that humans have. So we focus on responsibility and death and meaning and isolation. And so when we look at a client, for example, coming in and we're trying to really understand their story, understand what they're going through, what we do is we use our lens and we break it down into existential categories that then help us work with the client. And so it's just a tool, just like any other modality. But ours is like rooted in obviously philosophy, existential philosophy.
I know that you define self as a combination of responsibility, choice, and freedom. I never
Mm-hmm.
came across such a definition because usually I would hear people saying self, it's your inner self, it's your calling, maybe higher self, but freedom and responsibility, it's kind of like two categories that I think it's opposite, but maybe not so much. So how do they all work together?
Yeah. And I think my definition of self is not sexy. Like, it's not fun. You're not like, I feel so good to hear this. But hopefully, it'll be incredibly helpful. Freedom and responsibility, I feel like, are two sides to the same coin. You only have as much responsibility as you do freedom. And they're just so intertwined. What I mean by that is if you didn't have the freedom to make a choice, if that choice was forced upon you, you're not responsible for that. So let's say that your friend is joking around, they tickle you, they push you into something, and you break their vase. Chances are you're not responsible for breaking that vase because you didn't have freedom not to be tickled or laughed or whatever because they induced it on you. So that's a terrible example, but it's at AM, we're just going with it, right? Now, if you just went and pushed a vase, you had full freedom of the situation. Nothing forced you to do it. It wasn't a response to anything. And now you're fully responsible for breaking that vase. Again, there was a really dark example I had in my head, so I went with this one. So I think what we need to understand is when we have the freedom to make a choice, whatever choice that is, and I argue in the book that we almost always have the freedom, but when we have the freedom to make a choice, then we are responsible for that choice. We have to take ownership of that choice. And when we are not free to make a choice, then we don't have to take responsibility for it. And so I think they work really, really closely together.
To find like people, they always say like, oh, I did that thing because it's who I am. It's
Mm,
authentic self. But
mhm.
usually it doesn't come with that responsibility or freedom of choice.
Yeah, and I think what's so funny is the way that we've defined authenticity lately. It's like often the way I interpret how people use it is like feels good. This is just how I ended up showing up, so it must be authentic. And it's, people not apologizing for poor behavior, instead just saying, I'm just being authentic. I said that super rude thing to you because I'm just being authentic. Well, authenticity, when I was, as I was writing my book, the actual term in German is about ownness and owning oneself and one's decisions. And so if you really think about the word authenticity, I think it really signals responsibility. I don't actually think we can be authentic without being responsible, because authenticity means it's deliberate, it's aligned, it's responsible. And if you're doing things on autopilot, if you're doing things accidentally, quote unquote, if you're doing things out of habit, out of wounds, that's not you being authentic. And so I don't think that you can actually be authentic without being responsible.
Does it mean that there is no destiny or fate, and pretty much we write our own story with every decision and every choice that we make?
So when I talk about freedom, I do understand that there's constraints on our freedom, and so did Sartre. So like, we're not all free to the same extent, and I understand that, and I think that's a really important thing to emphasize. Some people have more freedom than others, and our responsibility again will reflect that freedom. And I use Viktor Frankl as an example of, he didn't have much freedom in the concentration camp, yet he's the one that wrote about this concept of freedom a lot. And he said at the end, even while at the concentration camp, he had the freedom to create meaning. He had the freedom over his attitude. He didn't have freedom over when he woke up, what he ate, if he saw the doctor, or even if he lived or died. So he got stripped away from every human freedom, and yet he argued that he still had a sense of freedom. And so I think that's a really important thing to present, just so that people are not like, I'm not free to do it. And it's like, I totally get it. Some of us don't have certain freedoms. That being said, I don't believe in destiny personally. That doesn't mean that you can't. I just don't think, I think even if we do decide to believe in destiny, do we not want to be a part of it? And for me, it's like, do you still want life to just happen to you because someone wrote out a story of your life and you're just going through the motions? Or do you still want to believe and take autonomy in this story, even if it was predestined? So I think it's a very personal choice of your worldview. But for me, what gives meaning to your life is the agency of living it, regardless if you think it's predestined or not.
People who, as you said, they do things out of habit. They don't think too much about it. It's like it's a pattern of their behavior. Does it mean that at some point they lost themselves? Because if they wouldn't, why wouldn't they take control of their actions and how they interact with life?
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point, something I like to talk about in terms of like, every action, I think, brings us closer to an authentic sense of self and inauthentic sense of self, or an inauthentic sense of self. There is no action that's neutral. And that is so hard for people to grasp, because it's so exhausting and annoying to think that everything you do, from when you get up to what coffee you have, to the conversation that you have, to the job that you're choosing, to the clothes that you're wearing, is going to shape you. But the reality is, every single thing that you do and encounter, including this conversation I'm having with you, is going to shape me in some way. And this is why I have to be so deliberate of like, who am I choosing to have a conversation with and about? Because I'm constantly being molded in one direction or the next. So I think the self is constantly fluid, and we have to be incredibly cautious of how we use it. And I forgot your question. You actually had a question and I went off on a tangent.
You don't believe in
Oh,
destiny per se. We are creating our own destiny with the actions that we take. And as I also like to say, even if you believe in destiny, and I do believe to some extent, but I also
mhm.
believe that it's impossible to reach it if you don't participate in life.
Mm,
Your destiny may be to have a beautiful family, but if you're not going to take that action and meet new people, go
mm,
outside of your apartment, your destiny, how it's supposed to like come into fruition? Nobody gonna knock at your door and say like, here I am. Your
Yeah,
husband.
to exactly. And I just saw this meme that was like all these women saying how they want to meet a great guy, but they're sitting at home every single night. It's like, what do they expect that we're gonna like go into their homes and tear down their doors? And I think that's slightly what you're talking about. Um, I think passivity, yeah, um, regardless of what you believe, I think passivity is often where we lose our meaning, and is often what stops us from being either our authentic self or living out our destiny, or however you like to word it. I'd like to think that there's a greater purpose in life, and I do believe that. Destiny just seems so predetermined for me, where it takes away free will, and then I have an issue with that because I think we have free will. Um, and I think when people become really passive, this is when it's so easy to get lost. So, to your actual question, I think being on autopilot is one of the easiest quote unquote ways to get lost, because no one blinks an eye when you're on autopilot, because so many of us are, and it's so easy to do. And we're still meeting all the societal expectations, but what we're not doing is meeting our own needs. And so this is where it becomes really dangerous. Do I think everyone that goes on autopilot becomes lost? No, I think self-loss is a really serious, painful thing. And some people just become inauthentic for a time being. I think to become lost, it has to be more chronic and more severe. But I do think that autopilot is one of the easiest ways that we do it.
Are there any like subtle signs of losing yourself? And also, I'm curious, can it be actually beneficial to some extent to lose yourself? Maybe then you can recreate yourself completely.
Totally. So I think um, the only time that losing yourself would be beneficial is if you're aware of it. So, do you know what I mean? Like, if you're lost and you don't know you're lost, I'm not really sure what the benefit of that would be. But I think if you're lost, and this is what happened to me in my example, and that's how I start the story of like, if you're lost and then you have that really earth shattering moment that you're lost, I think it's almost like hitting rock bottom. And to some extent, it snapped me into reality. It snapped me out of my autopilot. And I don't know, and I don't think I would have otherwise. So I think I almost had to hit such a severe disconnection and sense of emptiness and sense of confusion before I realized I didn't know who I was and that I wasn't living a life that was my own. So that, I would say, it's hard to say I'm grateful for the experience, but part of me is incredibly grateful for that experience. So that's when I would say, self loss can serve a really important purpose. Other than that, it's just a lot of pain with probably something that's not leading to a change. And signs of self loss. There can be so many. And I think the issue is that it's a holistic thing. When you're lost, it will impact every area of your life. So, again, I'll start with my own experience of a friend of mine and I were at a bar. We were hanging out. He was a friend from college. I was in grad school, haven't seen him in a couple of years. We were chatting, reminiscing, had the best time. And then he asked me a really simple question. And he said, "Sarah, are you happy?" And I think that's because we were also talking about like the things I was trying to accomplish and how my life was coming together. So I think for him, it was like a confirmation, like, "Hey, are you happy?" But what I appreciated about it is most of us go, "Wow, you must be so happy." We impose that feeling on someone. He actually stopped and just asked the question. And in that moment, for the first time, I think in my entire life, I realized that I wasn't. So I went to the bathroom and I looked in a mirror, and this is where self loss can also come in. For me, how I manifested initially, I looked in the mirror and I felt so disconnected from this woman. Like, I understood it was me. I wasn't fully dissociated. Like, I understood it, she was me. But at the same time, I realized that she was a complete stranger to me. And that was such a horrifying experience, to look in a mirror and not recognize the person you're seeing. Or what, also follows that is seeing so many of my actions and not knowing why I made those decisions. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're like, why did I just do that? Like, and then you just like don't understand, because you go, Did something take over my body? That makes no sense. That was a terrible decision. I know better. Like, why did I do that? And so there were many, many moments like that. The types of relationships we end up in, the inability to make decisions, the contentious relationship we have with our body, all of these can be manifestations of self loss. And all of them can also be the cause of self loss. And so I think that's the really complex and interesting part of it.
I can relate so much to what you just shared. And that's why when I was reading your book, I started to highlight things, but then I had to stop because, like, the entire book was highlighted in yellow. I'm like, okay. But that's exactly like how it happened to me when from the outside, it looked that I was supposed to be happy. I had a
Mm,
really good job. I had all those degrees. Like, I was financially stable. And then someone asked me the same very simple question, are you happy?
wow.
And I'm like, I probably don't even know what it means to be happy.
Mm, mm,
And then I also look at myself in the mirror and it hit me like, I refuse to believe that the purpose of life is wake up at certain time, go to the office, do the work. If you don't enjoy it, come back
mm,
home, have dinner, watch a movie, pay your bills, and then repeat. Like, it just like it's impossible. Like, and then the crisis hit because the
mhm.
question was, okay, I know I'm not happy. I know I'm not fulfilled. I can feel that there is something better and greater for me that can bring me that sense of happiness, but I have no idea what it is. And even like where to start. What would you say is the first step?
By the way, thank you for sharing your experience. I think it's a really important one because a lot of people assume the self-loss would be felt when your life is chaotic, like everything's falling apart, nothing's working out. When in reality, for a lot of people, it's when everything seems perfectly perfect. When you check off all the tasks in the checklist, and that happened to me at a similar time where it was like on paper, I should have been stoked about my life. On paper, society is patting me on the back, and I hated myself. And I think if you're listening and you're doing all the right things and you hate yourself, you don't need to be doing those right things anymore because they're not right for you. They're what society deemed right, and you don't need to constrain yourself by them. You don't need to surrender your freedom to such arbitrary constructs that society has told us would make us happy. And so I think that's a really, really important thing to point out.
If I don't like my job, how am I gonna pay my bills? Or maybe the career I'm in was chosen by my parents. I respect my family so much, so they will not understand my decision. There are like so many questions and not so many answers.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to point out. Um, Number one is that often when we think about meaning, we don't connect it to our sense of self. And I don't know why, because your sense of meaning, I think, will be very, very closely tied to who you are. For it to be authentic and meaningful, truly, it has to reflect your essence. And so, you trying to figure out this external meaning without first knowing who you are, I think, is almost an impossible task. Figuring out what your values are, figuring out what brings you joy, figuring out what aligns, figuring out how you want to show up in the world, how you want to serve, how um, you want to conduct yourself throughout the day. These things are incredibly important in order to find something that genuinely fulfills you, because I don't think meaning is the same for everyone. And I also don't think something that you find meaningful now will be meaningful forever. And I think this progression of meaning is really linked to your progression and fluidity and evolution of self. And so I think if you're someone who's really struggling with what brings me meaning, maybe take a second to reflect on, like, am I pretty firm in who I am? And if you see that that's not, a completely solidified idea for you right now, maybe that's something you should work on. And when I say solidified, that's a tricky word because I think yourself is constantly changing, but I don't think, I think it was Kierkegaard who said, you can't look in a mirror and go, this is who I am, but you can look in a mirror and go, this is who I am right now. It's a really good summary, and I think it's important that if you can look in a mirror, that you can look in a mirror and go, this is who I am right now. And when it comes to, expectations, familial expectations, I mean, I come from a Balkan household. I understand what those are. I understand how deep they run. I understand the clutch they have on your life. And when it comes to any other expectation, my question that I kept going back to and that I encourage people to go back to is, who are you living your life for? If you live your life for your parents, of course, there's something really beautiful and honorable about that choice, but you have surrendered your life. Your life is no longer your own. And I think that's always a price. That's way too high of a price. And I don't think anything is worth that price. And so for me, I always had to go back to, who am I living this life for? Who does this life belong to? And even if you lived your life for others, even if you lived your life for your community and for your parents and for your kids, it will not be enough. I know that we hope that, like, if others are happy, we'll be happy. The reality is that others can be happy and you can still be miserable. And I don't actually think it would be enough the second you don't live for yourself. And I'm not saying have a selfish life, but you do need to have a life that's rooted in you and in your authenticity.
First, you have to take care of yourself, so
Mm-hmm.
then you can also better show up for others. Because if you're not happy and fulfilled inside, or do things that are not aligned with you, like, even if your purpose is to help others, starts with yourself and then keep
Mm-hmm.
building.
Absolutely.
I like what you said, that the self is a combination of who we were, who we are right now, and our future self. But
Mm-hmm.
then, what about when people say, if you feel lost, go back to your childhood when you're 5, 6 years old, and you will find all the answers there before
Mm-hmm.
all the conditioning started. Do you think it's true?
You're putting me on the spot. Um, no, the simple answer is no. I don't think it's true. I don't think your sense of self could have been developed by the age of 5, fully, holistically, complexly. I think going back to that age could be a really beautiful way to look at the parts of you that maybe you've lost from your childhood, parts of you that were incredibly authentic, that felt incredibly authentic back then, and you can evaluate if that still feels authentic. Um, but do I think that our entire essence was created at that young of an age and then life has taken it away from us and now we have to go backwards? No, because I think the becoming of self is something that happens in the present moment
Mhm.
continually by our choices, our freedom, and our responsibility. And so I don't think the past itself can have all the answers. Do I think it has some really valuable answers? Absolutely. Do I think it's all of it? No. And, I talk about the necessity and the possibility, and that's, if you want to simplify it in some terms, it's the past and the future, and yourself is constantly in between those, and yourself is constantly becoming. And so as much as I think it's really important to look back into our childhood, and I also think a lot of, attachment formation and I mean, there's just so much valuable theory. And if I'm talking to my client, we're digging into the childhood. Like, we're sitting there, we're talking about it, we're spending time on it. But I don't think that you can find a whole sense of self in your past or in your childhood.
I know in your book, when you were talking about different causes of self loss, one that really stood out for me, was really surprising, is the desire to be lost.
My bonus
Like,
one.
yeah, like, why? Why someone would actually want it?
Yeah. Um, I think because it's exhausting otherwise. I think people find it sometimes exhausting. And it's that whole, like, you're constantly being conscious of your decisions, you're constantly being intentional, you're taking things very seriously, you're taking responsibility for every single thing that you do. And although I think that's liberating and exciting, there are two ways to look at it. I look at it as your playground. I think about it as being really messy, and you're painting and you're molding life and you're having so much fun, but you are taking responsibility and you are very cautious. Think about creating any piece of art. You're very intentional about what you're doing. The other side of it is it's just so exhausting and annoying and tedious, and we don't want to take responsibility. And so I think what happens is, and I've been there because obviously I've been lost. And I think part of it was intentionally lost because I didn't want to do the work. And as much as it was painful to be lost, I thought that doing the work would be more painful until the deep loss really kicked in. And then I was like, I think I'm dying. So just kidding. I'm actually going to do the work now. Um, and, I have an example of Chad in the book. Chad is a guy who had something really, traumatic happen to him in high school. He either got cheated on by his first love or his parents got divorced. And so Chad is now 30 something years old, mistreating every single partner he has. Okay? Potentially, Chad could be lost for argument's sake. So why is Chad not creating his sense of self? What would your answer to that be?
I think maybe either he is just overwhelmed, or maybe he started this journey, but then the more he would discover, uncover about himself, the more painful it would get. And then, oh, it's probably not working for me. I'm not going to do that.
Totally. Like those, exactly. That, and the only, I think, third alternative is Chad doesn't know he's lost. So Chad doesn't know he's lost. It's too much work or it's too painful. And I think, it's really important to think about, when does Chad become responsible for the way that he lives his life? At what point can we go, Chad, I understand that in your past you've had something really terrible happen, and I fully empathize with that. And you need to take responsibility for how you're behaving right now. And not because of the people you're dating. A lot of people are like, oh, yeah, if Chad was better, that would be great for the people he's dating. Like, it's not about the people he's dating, because the people he's dating need to take responsibility for the fact they're dating Chad, who is mistreating them. So I I actually, yes, I empathize with them, but I'm not concerned with them in this scenario. They have their own responsibility. I think Chad needs to take responsibility so he can liberate himself, so he can live a fulfilling life, so he cannot allow his past to dictate his present moment. This is why I think responsibility is powerful and liberating, but it takes a lot of work. And sometimes we would rather stay lost because it's really familiar. And we know the human brain loves whatever is familiar because it feels safe, even if it's incredibly painful. We would often pick familiar pain than an unfamiliar option or possibility. And so this is when I say, like, some of us are choosing to be lost. Too painful, too unpredictable, too unsafe, too tired. Life is exhausting. And if you're barely making ends meet and you're barely putting your kids to bed and you're so tired, the last thing you're going to do is try to figure out who you are maybe in that moment. So I get it, but I do think it was an important thing to talk about.
So, for people who are trying to rebuild their life and be more who they really are, I know it can be very difficult to make different choices, right? You keep
Mhm.
like doing the same things you usually do, and then you can easily give up because motivation, I know, especially right now, January, everybody is so motivated to do something, but
Mhm.
it doesn't last.
Mhm.
So, what can someone do?
I know it's really unfortunate that a lot of us have to feel a heavy degree of pain before we will change. Most people won't change unless they feel discomfort or pain. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. I think understanding the importance of taking care of yourself, the importance of your own existence, is really helpful in that mindset of, like, there is really nothing more important than you. And that's not like an egotistical serve yourself, be terrible to others, don't serve, blah, blah. That's not what I mean. But the most responsibility you're ever going to take is going to be for the person you become. The only thing you can really control, despite us thinking we can control a lot of things, is how we shape ourselves. And so I think understanding just how important it is to live a life that feels like your own and that is authentic, I think can help motivate. But I don't think there's exercise to enhance motivation. Often it's like pain that motivates people into this change, which is, you know, unfortunate, but also we've all been there. We get it. It's the discomfort that leads there. And if you're someone who is trying to actively figure out who you are, I have one journaling question that I really like. It's really easy. Um, in my book, I talk about 3 different components of self, break it down to the mind, the emotion, the body. Obviously, you can work separately on each one. I think something that can be really helpful is to go, okay, if I just list these 3 items and just instinctually rank them from which I feel the most disconnected with, how would I rank it? And so probably for me would have been the body, then the emotion, then the mind. I feel like I kept the most connection with my mind because I love to overthink, and
Same.
then my emotions were like, depending hit or miss. I would have explosive emotions, then I would have no emotions at all. And my body and I were just not even communicating. And so I think sometimes it's important to go, okay, which of these relationships do I want to start with first? Because it can be so overwhelming to try to do all of it at once. And the one journaling question that is holistic that I love is, what did I learn about myself today? Even if you just started 2 minutes a day and reflect at the end of the day, what did I learn about myself? I think that can be really powerful because although the question is super simple, what it requires you to do is to observe yourself throughout the day. You can't answer that question unless you're attuned, unless you're observing, unless you're communicating with yourself. And when we think we know everything there is to know about us or about our loved ones, that is when we get in trouble. So I'd really encourage anyone to just constantly be asking that question and exploring who they're becoming right now.
I actually also loved another exercise from your book. If you don't mind, I
Ooh,
want to read it.
yes.
For me, it was very eye-opening and
Oh,
transformative.
good. I don't even know if this question was in the book, but I'm excited to see what you like from the book.
So, yeah, I think where is that? Um, yeah, it's on page 53. Here is the
I'm like
challenge.
opening.
Uh, Pick a day this week, and for
Mm,
this entire day, behave in a way that aligns with how you understand yourself. Approach the day as if every decision and act matters. Fill each and every moment with intent and keep checking in. Look for the feeling of resonance when you're aligned and at peace, when things feel right and at home within yourself. Remember, if being true to yourself is new for you, it may feel strange, awkward, and uncomfortable at first. Accept the discomfort of trying something different and give it time. I really love that.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, I think an experiment like that is such a simple way, not an easy way, but such a simple way to figure out, how do I understand myself today? If the concept of being that intentional forever is exhausting, try one day and see what you learn about yourself and also see the benefits of that. I think one of the best motivators is feeling the joy and the fulfillment and the agency and the liberation that comes with it. So I think the more you do it, the more motivated you're going to be to live a life like that.
It sounds so simple, but it's not easy to do because when
No.
I following this advice, I'm like, I want to do something and then I would do what's familiar. And I'm
Mhm.
like, oh my God, like my body is doing one thing, but my mind want to do something else. So you constantly have to like be present and focused and be in charge of your mind, body, like everything. It's definitely not
Mhm.
easy, but you feel so good at the end.
Yay! I was just going to ask, does it feel good at the end?
Yeah, you feel very, I at least felt very fulfilled. and happy, even though I didn't do anything special that day. If we talk about,
Mm.
like big things, but I felt that I accomplished something. And probably I just found a little bit more about myself. That's why I felt this way.
I love that. That's so cool. I haven't spoken to someone who's tried that exercise, so that makes me so happy.
At this point in your life, do you still ask the question of what's the purpose of it all?
Every day. I think there's phases where you ask that question more or less, but um, I think it's a question that used to unnerve me, and now I just kind of learn to be patient with it. And obviously, when a big project like writing your book ends, there's a little bit of like, okay, the goal is done. Okay, this big thing that created so much meaning is now in the world. And the question's always like, what next? And so it's a fascinating thing to think about something that was, by the way, it's still the most meaningful project I've worked on, but something that gave me daily meaning in terms of working on it is taken away because it's now out in the world. I had to sit there and be like, okay, what brings me meaning now? And, I do think that I'm in the profession that I am because everything about my work, my clients, my writing, my consultancy, whatever it is, brings me so much meaning. And it's probably why I chose to do it. But I ask that question all the time. And sometimes even outside of work, I'll be like, what are we on earth? Like, why are we, why? Like, what is this? And I've just decided to have a sense of humor about it, lean into the absurdity of it, and just kind of take a ride on this like existential wave instead of feeling threatened by it, crushed by it. I think of it as a really great check-in, as if a universe is just tapping me on the shoulder and being like, hey, we good? We still on track? You still feeling aligned? You still have meaning in your life? And so I'm trying to look at it as like an inner dialogue that's super welcomed rather than something that overwhelms me.